Time now is 8:15. Good morning. Now, hundreds of mothers who were forced to give up their babies for adoption simply because they were not married have written to the government, urging it to think again about issuing a formal apology.
The Women State Ministers in Westminster should follow the Scottish and Welsh governments, which issued their own apologies earlier this year.
The UK government says society was to blame for what happened to the women, not the state. But new research shows a different story, as Duncan Kennedy reports.
2 landmark apologies for forced adoptions in Wales.
And for this, the Welsh Government is truly sorry.
For the decades of pain that you have suffered.
And Scotland.
A sincere, heartfelt and unreserved apology.
It left birth mothers there overjoyed. But what about the rest of the UK? Well, a committee of Westminster MPs recommended the UK government also apologise. But whilst the government said sorry, it didn't offer an official apology. The government's argument for that is that 50, 60 years ago, it was society's attitude towards unmarried women and not the state that was to blame for forced adoptions. But today, that's being challenged. In a letter to the Prime Minister, hundreds of birth mothers argue the UK state was morally responsible for forced adoptions, and this injustice should, like Scotland and Wales, result in an apology.
Come on, babe. Come on.
The mothers include Heather Burnley from Shropshire.
I was 15 when I became pregnant, and that was in 1971.
Heather says pressure to give up her baby for adoption came first from a state-employed social worker.
She said it's going to be very difficult. Somebody, and she did use the word, would possibly call him a bastard.
She used that word?
She'd use that word, yes. I think that it was definitely we are here to make sure that your baby is adopted. You are not keeping it.
She then says in this Derbyshire hospital, more pressure came from midwives as she was giving birth.
There was no anaesthetic. The midwife said, perhaps you'll remember this. This will stop you doing it in future. This is to teach you a lesson.
That NHS midwife said those words to you?
Yeah, this is what you deserve.
Heather's baby boy was taken from her at 10 days. She wouldn't see him again for 34 years. Around 180,000 unmarried women were involved in this. Many had hoped this 1950 report laying out government policy would help them. As it read, it is considered essential to keep the unmarried mother and her child together if this is at all possible. The documents we've seen at the National Records Office in London show that often didn't happen. How do we know this? Well, because this letter says so. It's written by a group of organisations, including local authorities, adoption agencies and magistrates, to the then Minister of Health in June 1951. And it's almost a plea for resources. They say, mothers of illegitimate children are driven to adoption because they are unable to find accommodation. It goes on to say that she, the mother, is forced to part from her baby, whether she wishes it or not. Now, this letter ends up with other civil servants in Whitehall, and you see their responses, saying, we need to keep expenditure in bounds, we would not consider further expenditure. Now, these civil servants craft a letter to write back to these organisations saying, in terms, that there's not much more that the minister can do. The documents were discovered by Dr. Michael Lambert, who's about to publish this new research linking government policy to forced adoptions. We've seen these documents at the National Records Office in Kew. What do they show in terms of the state involvement in forced adoptions?
The documents show that the government were aware of the circumstances in post-war Britain whereby the claim that women were enabled to keep their children is simply not the case because the resources required to make that a reality simply aren't being provided, and that's a conscious decision on the part of the government, on the part of the British state.
Dr. Lambert says society did play a role in shaming unmarried women into giving up their babies for adoption, but that it was governments who could have done more to help them keep their children. Reunions with children did take place, but for many, like Heather Burnley, it took decades. She says an apology from the state for actions taken by the state would now be welcome.
That apology to me is vital. We did nothing wrong. You know, we all make mistakes. We shouldn't have to pay for them for the rest of our lives.
And Heather Burnley there, ending Duncan Kennedy's reports. Thanks to her for speaking to us. We can talk now to Dr. Michael Lambert, who you saw him in that report, and Diana de Vries, whose daughter was taken from her for adoption at just 12 days old. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Diana, you were 16 years old when you were pregnant, and I think at 6 months pregnant, you were...
I was near 7.5 months.
And where were you taken?
I was sent away to a mother and baby home on the south coast.
And with the intent of you having the baby, and then what? What were you told at that point?
I was told very little. I was told that I put shame on the family, so I had to go away and have my child in secret. And then I was told that if I really loved my baby, I'd give it to a proper family because I wasn't a fit mother. I wasn't fit to be a mother.
And the way it happened was you gave birth, you were in the ambulance alone, and then you gave birth, and then you went back to school and didn't talk about it for years.
Yeah.
It was just a secret, never mentioned with your family.
No, and I would stress that in situations like mine, there was no aftercare. So nobody ever checked whether I was all right physically, psychologically, emotionally. There was never any follow-up. So it was always just a secret that I was sworn to secrecy.
And how did that secret make you feel? Like, what overriding emotion was there, do you think, from that time until you did eventually meet up with your daughter?
It was a mix of trauma and dissociation, because there is that feeling of no longer fitting in society because there's this big secret. Having your first child is one of the biggest events in a woman's life. When that happens when you're very young, and then you are shamed for it, your child is taken from you and you're told you cannot talk about this experience. You're never acknowledged as a mother, there's no congratulations, there's nothing that is considered normal about it. When all of that happens, you don't feel normal anymore. I didn't feel whatever constitutes normal for years. I felt dissociated, traumatized, and separate, and that lasted for a very long time.
When, Diana, I'm assuming your memories of those times are clear. You describe them very clearly. They're seared in your mind. Do you remember when were you first able to tell anyone? Who were you able to share it with at all?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think it gradually began to come out in conversation when people talked about families. I think I was probably in my 30s, maybe, late 30s, I think, and I began to talk about it with people. And instead of the reaction that I was expecting, which was shock, horror, and just asking me to go away, people were sympathetic, and I began to realise that perhaps I'd misunderstood the whole thing. Perhaps I had actually been through something terrible.
Do you want to pick up, Dr. Lambert, on the technicalities of what we knew before and what you have discovered now? And this is all about the traditional line had been what was happening was a reflection of society. But what you have discovered is that there was policy. There was clear decision-making going on by the government of that era.
Absolutely. So the government's line for refusing to apologise for their complicity in forced adoption is that it was society rather than the state. And so what I've done as part of this research is I've gone to the Public Record Office, I've gone through the files of the Ministry of Health and other organisations in the government as well. And within one of those files, there's dozens and dozens of them, there is a letter from the Standing Conference on Societies Registered for Adoption. That is all the organisations, Barnardo's, Thomas Coram, those kinds of bodies. And they are writing to the government effectively saying that in their experience of managing adoption, that choice isn't being exercised, that force is being used. That's the language that they're using rather than sort of that I'm imposing now. They're bringing this to the attention of the government. In 1951, right at the very start of this process, the government, within the civil service, they talk amongst themselves, they decide what they can and can't or should or shouldn't do within legislation, and they respond. And they respond by saying, we are going to do nothing, that this situation is acceptable, and that it's been brought to their attention. So I think the government's line then to say that they're not going to apologise because the state wasn't involved doesn't stand up to the barest examination of this evidence.
Why do you think there's such resistance? I'll ask both of you, why do you think there's such a resistance for the UK government to apologise when the Scottish and Welsh governments have issued apologies?
I think there's probably a number of reasons potentially underneath the surface as to why that's been the case. I think you can't really speculate without asking the Department for Education.
You keep your lawyer head on, which is absolutely fine. Diana, you've been through the experience, and the Scottish and Welsh governments have apologised.
Yes, they
The
have.
UK government has said this wasn't the government, it was the state.
Well, now that I know that that wasn't the case, and thanks to Dr. Lambert, we have a lot more evidence showing state involvement, I wonder whether there are other issues that are informing their choices in this. And I don't want to speculate on it because I don't know what is going on behind the scenes, but I suspect there has to be something that is preventing them from wholeheartedly embracing the idea of apology and just saying, we're really sorry.
What does it mean? What does it mean to get an apology? More to the point.
It means everything. It means a validation and a vindication, and it means that we would have the burden of blame and guilt and all the other things we've carried for years taken from our shoulders and placed where it belongs, on the shoulders of the state. So we would no longer be carrying the label of sort of shamed woman.
Dana, can I ask you, I mean, you are so composed and so clear about what happened and what you've done. I can only imagine that over the years at different times, those emotions will have changed. I'm presuming there must have been anger. There must have, I know you've talked about guilt. You must have gone through all of those emotions over the years.
Shame is a big one because shame was very much externally imposed. Guilt because I couldn't do anything. And emotionally, I may look calm, but I'm not. So there is a huge amount of turmoil in just talking about these issues.
And what will help you? Well, I mean, I know presumably this is part of that.
Having an apology, a public, formal, unqualified apology from the government will enable so many women like me and the adoptees that are affected. It'll enable us to make a shift from feeling that we were wrong to accepting the acknowledgement that we were wronged, that we were the victim of injustice, that we actually went through something that shouldn't have happened. It will be huge, and it will help us begin to heal, because many of us still carry trauma. We still are triggered by tiny little things that suddenly, one will find oneself in floods of tears for no apparent reason. So...
We really appreciate you telling us your story.
Thank you. And I know, Dr. Michael Lambert, you're looking through really carefully. You found that one piece of evidence. There's loads more that you can look at as well, and you'll keep going. Diana, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's see, time now is 8:20.